welcome our moderator, Sarah. um, Sarah Howe, as you and many of you know, she's a poet, academic, and editor, and her first book, Loop of Jade, has won the T.S. Eliot Prize and the Sunday Times Young Writer Award. She studied at Cambridge, and then later on she's now working at King's as a lecturer in poetry. And she has, of course, won various fellowships like Hawthornden and Radcliffe Institute at Harvard. So I will hand over the event to Sarah, who will be introducing the theme and the poets.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for everything that you and your team have been doing with this fabulous festival. It really is such a treat, these many different events and lineups, and I'm especially excited about the one today. The three poets you'll be hearing from will all be reading and thinking and talking along the lines of poetry and society. So we'll leap off in our discussion after the readings from the questions that you'll have met in the blurb for the event on Eventbrite. Questions like, can one write poetry without thinking or caring about society? Or how does reality find its way onto the poet's page? The fact that these three poets all have quite different experiences, personal and familial, of emigration, diaspora or otherwise, and indeed have knowledge of various different societies as writers and citizens, should make for some fascinating contrasts, I would imagine. So the way that today's event will work, and thank you very much, good audience, for tuning in on a Tuesday lunchtime. We're so grateful to have you. The way it will work is we'll hear from each of our three poets, who will read for around 15 minutes each, maybe a tad more. And then I'll chair a discussion and invite them to think about a few shared questions. And then there'll be time, hopefully at the end, for a little bit of Q&A from you in the audience. If you want to ask any questions, either live via your cameras or in the chat, I'll be happy to field those for our poets. So without further ado, let me introduce our three poets in turn, in the order in which you'll hear from them today. Cheng Tim is a poet, teacher and music enthusiast from Hong Kong, and she's currently reading for the MSc in Creative Writing at the University of Edinburgh. She's in Edinburgh now. Her poems have found homes in Burfois, Daode, Char, Cordite Poetry Review, among many others. She's one of the co-founding editors of Edge, HKBU's creative journal. She's working on chapbooks which explore, and I think this sounds wonderful, Hong Kong's natural, urban and emotional landscapes, as well as desire and rituals through the lens of tattooing. Wonderful stuff. Laura Jane Lee is a poet and a copywriter from Hong Kong, currently based in Singapore, where she's also studying. Under her former name, she founded Kongpo Rimo and Subtle Asian Poetry Collective, and also won the Sir Roger Newdigate Prize, very prestigious prize from the University of Oxford. Her work has been recognised in various international competitions, including the Oxford Brookes International Poetry Competition and the Poetry London Mentorship Scheme, and she's been published in journals and newspapers internationally. Her pamphlets, there are two so far, include Chengyu Chinoiserie from Hedgehog in 2020 and the forthcoming Flinch and Air, which will be out, well, sorry, I think it's out already actually, from Outspoken. Yeah, I've ordered a copy, I'm very excited to see it. And then Natalie Linh Bolderston is a Vietnamese Chinese British poet. In 2020, she received an Eric Gregory Award and co-won the Rebecca Swift Women's Poets Prize. In 2021, she was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem. Good luck, Natalie, for the upcoming readings. I think it's going to be amazing. Her pamphlet, The Protection of Ghosts, is published with V Press, and she's currently working on her first full-length collection. So a big virtual round of applause for all of you.
Sarah is muted, so I guess I will just start now. Before I begin to read 3 of my poems that I am really proud of, I would like to commemorate today. Today is the 28th of September, so 7 years ago today, in 2014, something big happened in Hong Kong. So the police deployed tear gas on local civilians who joined civil disobedience activities, including school strikes and occupation across different districts in Hong Kong. So the deployment of tear gas back then was rather unprecedented. The most recent occasion by then was during the World Trade Organization meeting in Hong Kong back in 2005, where a bunch of Korean farmers protested against agricultural policies to the world. On the 28th of September 2014, the tear gas deployment against peaceful civilians led to widespread discontent and further demonstration. And those demonstrations were called umbrella movements, revolutions, or uprising to different people. So to be reading poems today means a lot to me, because I do think that I write because of the trajectories that are in Hong Kong. And I'm very honored to have met my peers, my teachers in this event. So for example, I met Sarah back in Hong Kong at a workshop, and that workshop led to 2 of my first ever published poem. And I've met Laura in Hong Kong, and then I've met Natalie on different literary journals, and I'm like, yes, Natalie made it there, and I'm gonna submit something to those journals too. So it's a really huge honor for me to be here. Before I read my poem, I would also like to acknowledge all the Anglophone Asian poets who made writing possible for me. So, and one of my biggest influences is Nicholas Wong, who'll be reading on October 3rd for the same festival too. And I would like to quote him from his latest collection, Beseech Me. This bit, can I actually share screen? Let me do the Zoom thing. Okay, here you go. So I read his poems mostly on his Instagram. So this excerpt comes from his poem titled City Mess, Mother Mess, Fluid Mess. And it actually inspired quite a lot of the poems that I'm going to share today. So, comfort never comes home. Nothing emptier beats emptying. Can you be shockproof? I ask language, weight laid, it arcs away. Its last spark, not the brightest, but the one queuing smartly, a cry, asking of what poets are for, and not ever. So I read this poem on Instagram. I did not know it was his, and I was really amazed by how it contemplates the relationship between pain and language. And by some really unlucky occasion, I finally found a way to put my favorite word from the excerpt, shockproof, into a poem. I guess I would just read the poem before I explain how it comes into being. Shockproof, Saikon. There are so many ways of breaking. In one, he cried on my shoulder, hearing how mending teenage bones, fractured by a certain gravity the night before, would take too many nails and years. In one, everyone asked if he could fill the breakage in household items with lacquer and metal powder, overlooking the burn before all that golden joinery. In one, we went to the fringe of the city, despite the city, to see the work of earth movements tower by the rolling sea. Hexagonal basalt columns given rise by the uniform contraction of lava gushing, then cooling in seabed depression 1 billion years ago. Rocks, sacrifices, and songs, I love you twisted, I love you straight. I'm aware there were so many ways of breaking. They don't always lead to magnificence. In one, it doesn't matter if we could tell stitches and forensic underscores apart. In one, it does. We've broken the seismic silence to points where we know more than was not told. I'm not asking if the breaking counts as mine. I'm not a baby needing elders' protection, like a loop of jade that shatters against evil, or a silver necklace that turns black, absorbing fever. I know too well that only my own unmaking can save me. I'm just a little less than shockproof. So Cicada, a literary journal curated by my favorite Anglophone Asian female writers, generously published a poem. And to be honest, I think if I were ever invited to other readings, after this, I will be constantly reading this poem because to me, it strikes me as one of my most polished and intimate poems about Hong Kong. So I've been trying to map the emotional landscape and the natural landscape that I did not find interesting about before all the political things happened. And I thought that maybe before Hong Kong would change its shape forever, I will try to keep things that I treasure and value in words. So in a sense, they are sort of kind of like painful love poems. And also, I am really interested in individual responses to collective traumas. So in the poem Shockproof, I was thinking about all the instances of young people falling from heights. Some of them could be students, some of them could be protesters. They could be falling from heights voluntarily or involuntarily, and people around them, what would they react to such a sudden and painful event? And I wrote Shockproof, not knowing where I will end up in. I was just listing instances of things that could break. And for some reason, like after completion, after Cicada published it, I just realized that, no, why was I writing Loop of Jade that would break as a sort of protection? And at that point, I realized that I didn't know that I was also trying to adhere and trying to break the many traditions that I come from. So I quoted Nicholas Swan's City Mess, Mother Mess, Fluid Mess. I quoted Sarah's Loop of Jade, which I take with me everywhere when I go, especially in response to a line, if I break it now, it as in the Loop of Jade, will I be saved? And I was also thinking of lots of pop songs that I like. So I quoted Jamie and Common's 15 Petals. I love you twisted, I love you straight. I write it all down, but I can't concentrate. So I think that sort of encapsulates all my writings. I write when I can't concentrate in the coming and goings in the world. And yeah, sorry, I tend to over-explain. So, and my second poem that I'm going to read is Deluge. Again, I will over-explain after I read it. Deluge. All this rain, as if the sky is closing in to make the streets narrower. It never occurred to me that we could be the offsprings of some half-fish creature with human legs and arms. Centuries of salt revolts survived in our veins. Our mountain's name is the proof, Daiyu, big fish, also big rain at its lands. It's one of the many same stories where we migrated from what gave life, but it calls for our return in structures, small, sudden, that soundproof. Doors can't keep the water out, trains, an aquarium of strange fish. News from mother's hometown leaked, and I thought of how I could have been one of the casualties had mother not moved to Hong Kong, where ridicules on everything, deaths included, over mainland China is the few things we could claim control. About Zhengzhou, a place that shares my absent blood father's surname. All I knew was the singer's raspy voice, censored, mulling over the loss of somewhere, something, someone. We see them and don't see them. Where's the singer now? How many drowned? I wish I could write about something else, like what the mist is doing after rain. So this is Deluge. Again, I've been trying to learn to acquire the poetic language that's apparent in many cultures. So water definitely comes to mind. And it came from my addiction of reading the news until I can't fall asleep. So the poem was written in one sitting after a night where I couldn't bear with the online images about the biggest flood in Zhengzhou, a province in China. And when I was stuck in my workplace, feeling tired because I couldn't fall asleep, and I was thinking over the online images that I saw of people drowning, and I was thinking like how we come to terms with natural disasters or man-made catastrophes, and sort of myth-making qualities in how we know about our history and how we read the news. And I was also trying to address my limitations in thinking about politics in China and my poetic capacity in some way. And then, but I really like the poem in a way, because I'm not sure if you can see the pictures here, but I try really hard to transform images. They could come from memes, they could come from like big mythical paintings from a long time ago. So I was thinking about how we related to fish, and then there are sort of memes that sort of go together even though they're from across different disciplines. So right hand side are some memes that are about evolution, and the left hand side is about a myth in Hong Kong. So this half-fish figure called Lo Ting. Some people say that they could be the ancestor of all the Hong Kongers here. And it happens that Hong Kong has always been a place of rebellion. Even centuries ago, lots of villagers were selling salt and they were unhappy with the government's arrangements. So the government killed a bunch of them and they still protested. So I was thinking about like all these, how something could be associated, and that really interests me because I never knew so many things about home until I came in touch with poetry, which helps me pay attention and transform things. But of course, I am always a bit insecure in the way that like I can only write about certain topics. So the two poems I just read were kind of huge. They deal with like grand imageries and stuff. And then, so the third poem that I'm going to read is an attempt to look at things that are smaller. It's actually published in Canton Cutie, a diaspora magazine curated by a bunch of Cantonese people in the States. And it brings together so many people with Cantonese ancestries across the world together. So this poem is sort of like a parting gift that I wrote for my coworker who's leaving Hong Kong. And I'm thinking of her as a strong, independent mother. And I'm also thinking of the joy that his 2-year-old son brings us when he is curious, when he is angry, when he's dealing with all sorts of emotions, often like almost seem too big for his tiny, tiny brain. So the third poem is rudimentary Cantonese. And the baby's name is Shan Shan. That's why the poem is for Shan Shan. Your toddler's accents renewed Tongzi, poems from the Tang Dynasty, grazing anxious aunties before sleep, who play your videos on repeat. Lines live on beyond the poet's intention. 花落知多少 final 知道少 flowers fall, who knows how many. 最終 tickle, smile. Your mother goes by the name C, knowing he'll be as stubborn as me. H stands for home, Hong Kong, but more importantly, honesty. You will gain a new mother tongue. Cantonese may just live among your household in the tilted rhymes of spring sleeping in mine soil. So I hope that I can make the 2-year-old read this poem in 2 years' time. That's why with all the easy rhymes and stuff, and actually stole his baby accent, because I really enjoy how baby read sad poems without knowing what they mean, but still take pleasure from the sound. So final Dicto Seal is actually how it sounds to adult ears, when the 2-year-old reads Man Ho Yin's poem Chun Hill. And yeah, so I've been remixing lots of like intertextual references into my poems too. And I guess that's my responses to the really big idea of poetry and society. I'm just trying to see things through, trying to give shape to feelings and see if I could do something nice for the people around me. So yeah, I hope I'm not speaking too fast. I'm very nervous. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tim Tim. Shall we move on now to Laura Jane?
Hello. Thank you everyone for coming.
Tim Tim, I think you might need to stop sharing your screen if that's, yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. So I'm gonna read a few poems today. They're all from my new pamphlet. I'm not gonna share the text. I hope that's okay, but I want to share a few related photos, if that's okay. So the first one, if I could share this. Okay, should be able to. Are you able to see this? I hope so. So the first poem I'm going to read is about my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. Her name is Dang Cheng. And in my new pamphlet, I sort of had, it's mainly about Asian women and their experiences, sort of in conversation with my own experience as an Asian woman. And the first poem, or the first person I wrote about is my papa, Dang Cheng, and all of the women in the pamphlet have bios, most of them. So she was born in 1936 in a small farming village in Daomun, Zhuhai, in Guangdong. And she was born to a family of farmers, and she was the third child and only girl in a family of 4 children. She was very poor when she grew up, but she was very happy, and her father doted on her a lot, which is the subject of the poem I'm going to read. And he was also very ahead of his time in recognizing daughters as equals to sons. And they were largely unaffected by the Cultural Revolution, as they were from the working class. But there were also certain unfortunate events, such as her sister died on her back at a very young age. Around 20, she left the village, and she faked illness, and said she was going to Hong Kong to find a cure. And they let her through the border because she had a photo of a relative in the US, and he looked very smart. So they let her through the border, and she went to Hong Kong, where she dated a lot of different people, different suitors, but she settled on a sailor, which is, as you see here, my grandfather. And yes, I don't know why she did that, but from her, I inherited mischief and vanity, and here are some of her stories. So the first poem I'm going to read is De. De. That yellow morning I was delivered to your arms. You pitied all the daughterless men. The ones at the gambling house, cigarette-stained, roughened, saying, daughters slender as rye stalks are no use in the fields. Like the gambling house. That yellow Cheng, clear pearl. Which the dauntless men at your gambling house? Bet they didn't know the cry of a daughter as different from the cry of a son. The cry of a daughter thaws and fills, so it was instinctive that come harvest, full bushels of grains and gourds, and whatever you did not gamble away, were traded in the market next town for a pot of rouge and a jar of powder. So a child might giggle to her painted girlish face in the one cracked mirror of a bare bones house. He even insisted that I have shoes. Many girls didn't. So I could join the Republican Scouts, which later became the Communists' marching band. But alas, even then, with a daughter, a poor man is poor. So when instead of marrying a farmer who promised 50 cows, your daughter decided to leave the village for Britain's shining crown colony, you went down, that one yellow morning, to the gambling house and won 50 cows worth of money from all the dauntless men you pitied. I won 50 cows worth of money from the men at the gambling house that one yellow morning you decided to leave this slow place for Hong Kong. A string marriage to the man who promised 50 cows to this poor farmer. I remember how the Communists' marching band used to be the Republican Scouts. How I insisted you have shoes so you could join. Many girls couldn't. And how, my child, you sat in our bare bones house with the one cracked mirror, giggling to your girlish face, painted with the rouge and powdered I bartered for in the market next town, with that harvest bushels, grains, gourds, and whatever I hadn't gambled away. It's instinctive. The cry of a daughter is different from the cry of a son. It thaws, fills. They didn't have the pleasure of knowing that, I bet. All them dauntless men at my gambling house, howling. Men with daughters have used up all their bad luck. Clear pearl, Cheng. Your mother said it sounded like when I told her I had lost it all. Cheng. All my money's worth at the gambling house, gone that yellow morning. I rocked you in your cloth swaddle. But as I held the world in your tiny creature body to the hollow of my neck, I pitied all the dauntless men. Paupers, they too had mouths to feed. Crying, sucking, screeching mouths. And 2 sons later, I can tell you that daughters are not a waste of good rice. And no, I could not bear to have you, frail as a rice stalk, work a day in the field. So when you were swaddled, your call newly alive, I counted the fresh days and yellow mornings, the men with their sons, and considered the way I was delivered to you as a man with such fortune. So yeah, that was the first poem, and these are some pictures of my grandmother. This is her in Hong Kong, I think, in her flat. Yeah, that's her as well. That's her with my aunt and my uncle and my grandfather over there. That's me. um, and that's me and my brother and her in New York. She liked to travel a lot, actually. She was a very adventurous person. And this was all of us back in the village that she was born, right before my grandfather passed away. He built her a house there in her village, not his village. But yes, that's the first poem. I suppose for the second poem, it would be better for me to actually share screen for the poem because it's a very visual poem. It's about a very legendary lady. Her name is Yang Changman, and she's actually the great aunt of a close friend of mine. She was born to a Malaysian Chinese family, but she immigrated to Singapore, and she studied biology, fisheries, copepods, and she worked in zoology and marine biology. But after she got her diploma, she was appointed curator at the Department of Zoology, which had to take over the Raffles collection because I think the museum they didn't want to do like animals anymore. So she had to find a place to keep these specimens, but they weren't rehomed until 2015. So I think for around 16 years, if I'm correct, they just shuffled from one place to another and she was taking care of them. Noah's wife. After the men had sought out 2 of every animal, herded them, male and female, on board that insurmountable eyesore. She found herself at once put to work, conferred stewardship of exotic beasts, guardian of a vast menagerie of creatures, skittish in their skins. Bones, restless as children, lay stacked in coffin crates, cramped, refuge from all the rain where under the zinc roof she tended on them, kept them cool, dry, pestless with poison, which soon ravaged her blood. A tireless wench, adrift with the fishes in her own sea of formalin. While the men were off doing things of utmost importance, running the ark, keeping them afloat, the animals forgotten, all 130,000 of them, tacked up squalid, spooled in red tape, midst the deluge, where at night she lies awake, telegraphs God why, how, and when the waters will ever recede. Yet despite her best, some wild things begin to rot. The smell of sick carcass on her hair. It was grit that kept her going for 16 years, plucky as the black backbone of a whale, as more than once the men contemplate slinging them overboard. The woman to follow. Angered, she wires God another. Reprieve. Looks within herself for the matriarchal insistence to keep every critter and brute on board, preserved for the children of her children and the unborn to come. In time, the seafarers dock on a mountain far from where they boarded. And Noah emerges onto dry ground, declaring himself God's loyal servant, his men faithful keepers of the animals. This is when she wistfully yields her load to the land. It'll be years before we learn her name. So yes, this was based on a true story. And my publisher actually researched this and made a very interesting thread. I'll just share it quickly. If you're interested, you can, I think, go to their Twitter to see this. But yes, that's Madame Yang in her youth, and it's about the journey of the Raffles collection and how they were eventually rehomed in Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum in Singapore. Yeah, so she even made like little drawings of them, I think. It was an enormous task, and they had no budget, no resources, and the specimens were basically kept in like these Romney huts, which wasn't great for them. So a lot of them, like some of them didn't survive, but most of them did. And eventually she was named Singapore's Women of the Year, I think, of 2018. The last poem I'm going to read is about, it's based on a song. Let's see if I can share. It's about a woman called Lei Mei, and it's based on a song called 基與之樂 it's written by a songwriter. His name is Kenon Lee, and basically I was very touched, or I was really interested in the backstory of this song, and I went to interview him and his mother, because his grandmother, I think, no longer can really remember things, but they told me a lot about her, and I wrote sort of a list poem. So the song is called 基語, from Zhang Zi, Wai Zi, 基語之樂, and there is a reason why she didn't put 之樂, because I think he was not sure that she was entirely happy, but he was again not sure that she was entirely sad. So, fish wishes from a two-chambered heart. 1. To make no choices. 2. To heed the matchmaker's order. 3. To be brokered something you can swallow. C. A coin or affection. 4. To be tender and fresh. 5. To carry my own flesh to the sea. 6. To swim these careless bones. 7. To hold a mouthful of plastic questions. 8. To consider cardiac anatomy foolish. 9. To roam 7 seas with 5 fins. Last seen, Pacific. Missing, dorsal fin. 10. To be unbound from the island. 11. To cut through this hill. See Mount Davis. 12. To be coated with optimism. 13. To escape marination. Ceviche. Bitter, sour, spice. 14. To roll up the gate every morning. 15. To not know that time is a thief. Stolen, light, shadow. 16, to have the long years throw themselves. 17, to finally allow myself to sleep. On his bed, see, beside him. 18, to lose count of the days. 19, to be restless under my skin. 20, to keep me my scales. 21, to talk about the weather, that which I have weathered. 22, to sit by the window. 23, to let him hold me, under storm and sun. 24, to wish as a fish can, see in a net. And yes, it was based on this song. It's a very nice song, very nice Cantonese song, and I was very, very intrigued. I think it's the lyrics are incredibly well written, and it just packs so much in such a condensed form. So I was really interested, and I went to interview them, and this is the story of Lei Mei. Thank you so much for listening to my reading.
Oh, thank you, Laura Jane. Such wonderful readings today. And as I think is coming up in the chat already, so many connections between the poems just emerging organically. I'll hand over to Natalie now.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to attempt to share the screen now. Let's see. Share. Okay, I think I'm doing that. So this is the first poem I wrote because I wanted to explore the feeling of being very connected to and loving the sound of various languages spoken in my family, mainly Vietnamese, but not being able to speak them myself, because I think that creates a real sense of closeness, but also distance and loss. And I didn't realize until I grew up that this is actually a feeling that my mum shares, because when she was growing up, her parents spoke Mandarin and Hokkien together, but she didn't understand. So I also wanted to explore that point of shared experience that we have. Okay, so translations I never learned to speak. 1. 4 years after a day referred to as Ngày Giải Phóng or Ngày Mất Nước, depending. My mother steps off a plane to find she is only worth what she can interpret. Police bring in 2 boys and call on her to translate their crimes. Jagged nouns held by their edges. Đột nhập, break in. Keying, glass. Yé dong, copper wire. Mao, blood. 2. Mid-90s, a hospital with rose-dotted walls. My birth as a frothing at a newly drawn equator. She chooses an English name derived from an old word for Christmas. And oh, I can't scroll, hang on. I don't know why it's doing this. All right, I think, okay, I see, sorry. It was rearranged probably. Okay, I'll start the second bit again. 2. Mid-90s, a hospital with rose-dotted walls. My birth as a frothing at a newly drawn equator. She chooses an English name derived from an old word for Christmas, and a Vietnamese name that means soul. A midwinter offering, a hybrid that can live through snow. 3. She speaks to me as if sounds are inscribed in blood and can be inflated when the right valve is opened. Listen, 2 ways to say love. Yêu, a woman lying underwater, chest bubbling light. Thơm, the sun reaching for her wrists. Yêu, the last seed in a bird's dying throat. Thơm, the hibiscus that burst through its ribs. Yêu, the sky darkening with God's shadow. Thơm, the peaches that keep him immortal. 4. Our names written on a funeral service sheet in a language Ongwai never passed on. Ling, tinkling of jade pieces. Jen, loyal, faithful, chaste, virgin, virtuous, to practice divination. 5. The Millennium, a VHS tape of Paris by Night 53. A song called Gotham Ne Ne, Modern Girl. 4 singers wearing swirl-patterned aliyah, dancing in front of 2 stacks of moons. My mother's favorite, the girl in blue, as beautiful as Liu Ru Manjia, a willow concealed behind a bolt of pure silk, the mother goddess of a red cloud realm, cradling 2 halves of a jade cup. 6. After Ongwai died, Bangwai played the same chant every morning. Namo Ayida Fat, a way of obeying the light or inviting it to come back. 7. The remains of my great-grandmother's house in Xiamen, an outdoor shrine beneath a tin roof, damp smoke in our hair, a surrounding rubbish tip, an old woman living in a hut nearby. My mother wants to say something, but doesn't have the language for it. A stone column, a dedication chiseled in a script she can't read. It was like my mouth was broken. Later, we use our phones to find what we need. Bei ai, sorrowful. Jiangren bei ai, to suppress one's grief. 8. A platter of crab served at a place with pale green walls near my mother's birthplace. A woman pouring yellow lotus tea. Where are you from? My mother describes a gold-lit shop and a rooftop fruit garden that no longer exists. A nod, a hand hovering over the teapot. Vehicle. One wrist tethered to the sea. Back teeth unrooting at a seal border. A body half hidden inside a pink shell. A body divided by a line of coarse salt. So my next small sequence are poems after my great-grandmother in Xiamen. And I wanted to write about her because there's no one left alive in our family who actually remembers her, but we're still somehow hearing stories about her and fragments of memories passed down. So I wanted to write about her in a way that allowed me to hold on to those fragments in a way that I understood and could make sense of. 1. Journey, 1935. We always go where there are graves. When she dies of pneumonia, they drop 3 coins in her mouth, bury her under the house in Xiamen. 4 days after, her son kisses the floor, prays for new palms to pray with, searches for an eyelash, a used toothpick, a blood-tipped sewing needle, some sign that she lived. As if he was born to mourn the years she cannot reach, he waits for her ghost to return unwinged, but dawn will not open its mouth. Years later, soldiers come for the house. He digs the floor with his hands, holds her ribs to his cheek, and sets her alight in a barrel. When she is small enough to cup in his hands, he takes her to a temple in the mountains. When some unholy road rattles her picture from the wall, shakes every box soulless, he finds her a dust-red mausoleum, fits the sun around her photograph, and leaves for Sokchang. From the highest shelf, she hears him, singing a song she cannot understand, with his halved tongue. 2. Letter from her deathbed, 1934. My son, remember, there is nothing so holy it cannot be stolen. No child can keep my body from fever. My chest hangs open as the sea, my stomach a salt-shriveled fist. Son, lean your head to my hip. Remember how I crushed ginger to your ribs when you fell sick, rubbed warm spoons on your back, slapped flies from your lips. Remember you lived because I willed it. In my veins, find the beginning of every bruise, wisps of prayers, all the ways I cannot protect you. Learn how to bless my body, rinse a handful of my hair over the well, press jade beads to my lips, unbind my feet and rub with oil. Bury me in the gold necklace only my mother could undo. Son, pull the comb from my hair. Present it to your father's 3rd wife, the kind woman you will call mother. Load your mouth with her accent. Let her hold you the way this house holds its ghosts. Look, so many ghosts wait for me in the walls, like the drying rice grains left behind in my bowl. 3. Photograph, 1930. The photographer tells you, sit straight, legs crossed. Careful, show your feet. See, so small, small enough to be beautiful. You look past him through the window. The pink sky wears your stretch marks. You remember how your husband praised you for birthing a boy, how you tore bed sheets with your teeth, screamed for needles, donghuai, green tea, anything to quiet the pain. Someone took your son from your breast while you slept, his body still nameless and kissless. It has been 3 days since you touched his skin. You have stopped your blood with linen rags beneath your silk samfu. You have rebound your feet, plucked your forehead bare. Now he is on your knee, and no one is lifting him away. You notice someone has shaved the sides of his head. You discover the name his father gave him means pure water, a name he can use to cross seas, cleanse bad luck from his blood. You kiss your boy, stain a prayer to his cheek, point his face towards the snap flicker of the camera. Those 3 seconds of bullet bright light. The last poem I'm going to read is called Divinations on Survival, and it uses a form invented by the poet Cheng. It's called the I Ching, and it's named after a Chinese method of divination. And it's in the, so I've written this in the alternating voices of my grandmother and my mother. And I've used both the Chinese and Vietnamese names for each of the hexagrams and also the English translations. Divinations on Survival. Guai. Track team Y. Displacement, parting. 43. We left rain laced with tiny gods, slack-skinned sun like a cooked fruit unraveling across sea. In sagging boats, we spent nights learning every word for sorry, my body blue with exile. Since I learned it is a privilege to love, every birth feels like a killing. My child arrives in a chokehold. If only I could still my blood, long enough for this to end. Soon, Sen Tracto, diminishing. 41. 49 days since I tasted pork and you left for Saigon. How hunger coppers my mouth. Has it been so long since I found myself unmothered? I learned to avoid the last pig I can't kill. The days swarm like flies scaling my stomach. I smoke, I swallow my name and nothing else when I hear soldiers. Jiaren, Feng Wa Ya Nyan. Dwelling people, the family. 37. To keep you grounded as your mind glides up, I take you to every place you have laughed in, lost teeth. As if this country was still yours, I show you eras you cannot touch, in our garden of buried bribes. Here we finger bruises into flowers. You cry as if you know where I have scattered ashes. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalie. I sort of want to leave all of the poems that we've heard this afternoon to just resound in the air a little bit longer. But I suppose silence demands to be filled on these Zoom calls, doesn't it? Well, let's have a little bit of a discussion now between the 3 poets, and then depending how far we get, we'll start to segue over to some questions from the audience, because I have a feeling from the fantastic comments that have been coming up in the chat that the audience might be raring to ask some questions of you all too. I have so many thoughts coming out of the poems today and the connections that I found my mind sparking between the 3 readings and the sort of unexpected points of contact between them. So I guess one thread of continuity I thought I felt between all of the poems, or all of the poets today, is this sense of stories passed down, whether through families or through societies, stories at risk of being lost or forgotten. So for you as poets, how far is storytelling part of poetry's social role? I guess I'm thinking in part of the origins of, poetic meter in ancient societies as a way of helping them pre-literacy to remember what they needed to remember what they needed to remember about themselves as cultures. So yeah, how far is storytelling part of poetry's social role?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important part, and I could really see that in the poems that Tim and Laura shared today. So for me, I think of like writing as an act of like excavation and preservation. So with my practice, I think the family stories that I hear just tend to be very provisional. And what I mean by that is that they can change depending on just who you ask and who in my family is doing the telling. And also they're very fragmented and also uncertain. So when I'm trying to rebuild these fragments into kind of either asynchronous or more ordered stories, I'm trying to rebuild them in a way that makes sense to me and helps me to understand my place in the world and why I'm here, how I came to be here. And I think that when we do that, we might not reach a definitive truth, but we do reach this kind of emotional truth that helps us understand ourselves and the world around us better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I feel similar, because a lot of my pamphlet it started because I was interested in these stories my grandmother had, and I actually had to sit her down and ask her a list of 100 questions to sort of learn about my family history. But of course, a lot of these don't lead anywhere. It's just like, fragmented details, random miscellaneous things. But somehow when you put them all together, you start to sense, oh, there's a story here, and there's another story here, and all of these things you wouldn't really know if you hadn't very if I hadn't gone on purpose to sort of sit her down and interview her. I would have just heard maybe a few things here and a few things there. And I sort of feel like, because not all of this is entirely true, the premise of the poem that I wrote was true, but a lot of the details were not. So I think that also ties into, blurring the lines between, sort of what we know as like familial history or the history of our society, and also fiction, storytelling, because that's how myths are born, right?
I don't know. I do think that I know I'm being tricky with words here, but by admitting that the poems are not leading to anywhere, they could actually lead to somewhere, right? Because I do think that understanding how we feel is really quintessential, especially with all the information overload and things. Usually we share and we talk things that we never really thought through. And for me, it could be just a really personal example, but back in 2019, I was part of some Twitter group or whatever. I was spamming news all the time because I thought that would raise awareness, but past awareness of history, of like oppressions, then what's next? It's just like a bunch of self-consuming anger and grief that don't really go nowhere. So, and I thought, why don't we just take a step back and just look at the histories around us to see the small things that are around us. And I think that's actually more effective than a lot of the big things that are around there. So I guess when I say this, it's almost kind of religious in a way, that I believe in the power of quiet, small changes that poetry could provide, like fragmented small stories can provide, instead of like big sounding activism or whatever. But yeah, I do think they could lead somewhere. It's just that somewhere is not immediate, and we need that to be not immediate. Yeah, if I'm making sense here. Yeah.
I'm making so much sense. And lovely the way that through all of your answers was emerging this sense of what truth what poetry's relationship to truth is, and what kinds of truth, whether emotional truth or a truth that lies on the other side of fact, perhaps. And in your answer just then, Tim, the sense also that came out in your poems about, in your reading about the Hong Kong protests, in what sense is poetry powerful? You know, can poetry speak truth to power? I guess that's a question particularly to you, but I think that Laura Jane and Natalie might want to dip into that too.
Yeah, I think it's impossible not to interact with power structures when you're writing poetry, and especially with the way that we seem to be writing. Because like when I'm writing about my family, so many like decisions and policies and you know, other kind of really seismic events at a societal level have impacted the way my family has moved through the world, and the way that they've been received in various parts of the world. And I think that a lot of the time these really important histories can be marginalized, can kind of be swept away as something like inconvenient that you don't want to look at. So I think that as writers, we're kind of shedding light on that and making sure that these brushes with power, these like exercises of power, are not being forgotten.
Yeah, and I also think it's you know, various power structures, for example, certainly for you know, I think for the Noah's wife and for Fish Wishes from Two Chambered Heart, we very much, these women are going up against very patriarchal structures. And in Noah's wife, obviously, she was not, I think perhaps, you know, Yang Changman, she was not taken very seriously because of her gender and her age. And, you know, they didn't think that preserving these specimens was a very, you know, was something that was very important, of most importance to them. So they sort of left it to a woman. And as well for Lei Mei, she had to leave her village in China to go marry someone in Hong Kong that she did not know, had not met before, because her mother basically, well, she didn't sell her, but basically she promised her to a man in Hong Kong who said they would pay for her to come to Hong Kong to get married, and her mother had already taken the money and probably spent it. So she had no choice. She had to go to Hong Kong. And, you know, even you know, knowing this, she seems to have built a life for herself in Hong Kong, and it's not entirely as I know after interviewing her daughter and her grandson, that it's not entirely being led by her husband. She was a very strong character, and she basically you know, fed the family, kept them together. And I mean, I guess all of this is just to say that, you know, the stories of these women are more than just, you know, stories, individual stories. I think on the societal level, they say a lot about how women historically and even now are interacting with these power structures in the family and in the society.
Yeah, what Laura just said reminded me of something that I read about a Japanese author. I'm really bad with names and like concrete facts, but he says that he's not interested in the stories of people who get to choose to leave. He's interested in the stories of people who have no choice, people who choose to stay. And I feel like when Laura was talking about like people who had no choice and they were facing sort of like a chosen choice for them, but at the same time, they sort of made a life out of it. And that's the fascinating part. I think that my poems are trying to explore too. And I do think that the connection of choices between the poems that we read today, like we made conscious choices to foreground less dominant languages in Anglophone poems, things that people were taught that as not as important. And that's a deliberate choice for us. But of course, like that could go into like who's allowing us to make those choices. Like what if one day a publisher decides that, oh, they don't understand the translation, they don't see the audio dissonance or the significance of it. then yeah, so I really enjoy playing with all this tension. So I'm really happy to hear what you guys shared. Yeah.
Actually, could we pick up on that, this idea of making space in these poems? And I think that there's an interesting point to be made here about the way that you were all using formatting on the page, whether columns or slashes to mark alternatives or equivalencies, or parentheses to create sort of multiple layers and levels on the page. Do you want to all reflect on this question of how the language, or the mixture of languages in your poems, reflects the societies that you inhabit and move between?
So I think as someone with multiple heritages, I think that gets reflected in my poetics and the way that I use various languages, because I often feel like a fragmented person, even though I don't necessarily see other people like that. I often feel like a fragmented person. So the way that I use language is often very like fragmented or sporadic, or maybe not fully realized. And the point about form is really interesting, because the most eloquent phrasing about the slash form I've ever seen is the poet Nina Mingya Paus. She said that this slashes in the middle of lines feels like an attempt to punctuate herself into two places at once. I think that's how she put it. And I really, really chime with that. I think that it really suits this idea of poetics of fragmentation, of allegiance to multiple places, of trying to remember that you are more than one thing. And while feeling that you are split apart, you are also an entire person, and with many like coexistences inside you. So yeah, I think that's behind the like formal and language decisions. That's the kind of reasoning that lies behind all that for me.
Well, I think I'm perhaps reflecting on my use of parentheses and perhaps, the use of footnotes, because I always think that, footnotes are supposed to disambiguate, but I think in my list poem, at least, it sort of actually introduces the ambiguity, because, her story, even her own daughter, her own grandson do not know, was she actually happy? Did she actually want to come to Hong Kong? Did she actually, was her marriage happy? Did she have a happy life? They can't answer these questions for her. And thus I sort of use these footnotes as a way to introduce this, this ambiguity, this possibility that perhaps she wasn't entirely happy, but perhaps she wasn't entirely sad either. So it just creates like more space for us to reflect, or to perhaps understand her experiences. Perhaps, perhaps she herself doesn't understand entirely either. I think, especially the line I wrote about marination, the bitter sour spice. I actually took it from the lyrics, how there's going to be all kinds of like flavors in life, and you experience all of them. You don't get to choose, and it doesn't seem as if one was dominant for her.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I do think I'm trying to be as traditional as I can, to be honest. When I speak in daily life in Hong Kong, I don't really code switch. I try to be as Cantonese as I can, or as English as I can, which is really unnatural. So, but I guess I'm trying to mix the two things together in my poems, because I don't know, it's frustrating, because for many years, I like reading English. I like listening to English songs, but they're so far away. And now a bunch of Anglophone Asian poets have shown me that, no, actually part of my life could be in the songs, in the poems. And I'm excited and I want to do that. And I thought that by doing that myself, then other people could see that and they would know that actually everything about you or about things around you, you could just put them in a poem. And that's really liberating in one sense. But of course, like sometimes people ask me if I would write in Chinese again. And I would be like, yes, I could write in Chinese, but I'm going to sound like that 30-year-old version of me who's on online forum endlessly sharing memes and, like with all sort of like strange internet language. That could be a way to go too. So yeah, I'm really interested in how each poet like deliberately chooses like punctuations and making space to try to bring something new even to themselves. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you now about community. So I think as writers, we're used to the idea that we move or even need to move between society and company and solitariness in order to produce our work. So for you as poets, do you feel like you yourselves are part of any particular community or communities which are important to your writing? This might be as small as a workshop group or as large as a diaspora.
I think for me, first and foremost, I feel very much a part of the community of my immediate and extended family, which sounds a bit weird, but it is a very big family, because it's kind of their stories and rituals and acts of care that really inspire me to write. And also, I think whenever I feel a bit adrift, like either as a person or as an artist, I think that talking with my mum really helps ground me and remember who I am. But also, like, zooming out from that, we're obviously part of this wider Vietnamese and the communities of Vietnamese and Chinese people living in the UK. And I think that some stories within those communities might share commonalities in some way, but obviously no two experiences are exactly the same. So as someone writing from those communities, I think it's really warming to know that people might relate, but I'm also always conscious of trying to highlight that this is a Vietnamese or Chinese experience and not the Vietnamese or Chinese experience, because I think it's important to understand that there isn't just one single experience. These communities are made up of many, many different experiences. So yeah, I think those are the kind of two communities I keep maybe most in mind when I'm writing.
I suppose it's pretty lowbrow to say this, but I started writing because of Tumblr. So it used to be some online blogging platform that I feel like is no longer really alive, but I feel like it's great for it was great for me starting out because it offered some level of anonymity, but still it's sort of like putting my writing out there in the void, and sometimes some stranger comes along and gives me feedback or talks to me about it, and that really gave me the confidence to start putting my work out there. And I think after sort of getting a bit more confidence, I also think some initiatives, writing initiatives, I don't know, like Kongpo Singpo they allow people to sort of write together, but not competitively, which I think is great. I think more of this is needed, because no two poems are the same, and they're very hard to compare. So I think these initiatives really just allow writing and ideas to be born through interaction solely, and through people thinking about the same idea in different ways. And it's very interesting to see this, I feel like.
Yeah, for me, I guess the communities that I identify with or have the most problem with would be the community of Hong Kongers and the community of poets. So like, I think being in a community could really go both ways. So it could be very empowering because, I mean, I'm very self-critical. So if I'm going to write something that's not about the community that I care about, I don't think there is a value in other people reading them. But then when I really feel something, when I experience something a community could bring light to, then I thought, okay, I'm writing something bigger than myself. And then they are giving me a voice. So I'm going to do a good job about it. So that's really empowering. But at the same time, it could be limiting. So for example, the second poem that I read, Deluge, is definitely not going to be the dominant Hong Kong sentiment that's out there. And then, so I remember when I was reading the news about Zhengzhou's flood, so many weird, bad comments came up, but they're funny. Like, I feel bad to find them funny. So they were saying that like the drowned train carriages were like forbidden bubble tea because human heads, drowned heads, black hairs, the bubble, and muddy water as the tea. And I was like, how would you say that? Men, their lives. And am I part of you? Are we still supporting the same cause if I disagree with your lack of empathy at this point? So, but I think that's an interesting space for negotiation anyway. So if we identify ourselves as in a community, then to what extent do our words or do our actions have to adhere to a community? And that's a really interesting tension that I would like to explore in poems too. And I feel like I'm sending 2 poems in the chat. I actually did some research because I do think that like people are asking poets to do a lot of things when they are not really supporting poets in some ways. So they're asking poets to say something all the time. But of course, I'm a poet who like to say things for people that I identify with. But at the same time, some poets are saying that like I should actually have the choice in saying that, no, I want to focus on something else now. I want to work on something else. And if you don't allow the choice for me, maybe we have different versions of space making. And so these 2 poems really bring to mind. And I try to quote some of the lines that I might not agree fully with, but I do think they really open up my idea of communities. Yeah.
Thanks so much all for your wonderful, thoughtful answers. It's been a very exciting discussion for me to hear you thinking aloud about your writing and your processes. I'd like to open up to the audience now. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of our 3 poets today? Maybe I should give everyone a little while to type frantically. While I do that, perhaps I'll just have a little bonus question for myself, which is about audience. I get asked this question often, and I find it a sort of difficult one to answer. But do you think that your poems imagine audiences for themselves? And if so, what do those audiences look like? Or is that something that you just have to hold at bay in order to be able to write at all?
I think I'm a very selfish writer. I write for myself. I write what I like. I write to enjoy the things I write. And I mean, if someone comes along and finds them, they enjoy them, good, great for them. But I'm not to say that I don't care about my readers or who reads my poems, but ultimately, I think I write for myself as sort of a practice in a way, because a lot of the times you think about, you start thinking about what poems are marketable or what's really the trend out there right now. What sort of poems do people want to read, or what do journals want to publish? But I think in a way I'm really reminded of what Alice Oswald told me. She encouraged me by saying, really don't get caught up in the rat race of poetry. Unfortunately it is true. And ultimately it's if you like poetry, if you love poetry, it's going to be more like a religious practice for you, something you practice every day, rather than producing something for the sake of publishing it or for someone to read.
Laura, I really love that idea of this kind of intimate audience of one you've imagined. I think that's really beautiful and freeing. I'd say for me, it's a little bit similar in that the first audience I always imagine is my mum. She's mostly always my first reader. And I think that because the first time I felt like I was a poet was when I showed her something that I'd written that was kind of about one of the stories she told me, and she was moved by it. So I think that's the first moment when I felt like I was writing for a purpose. But also, I think that I've come to realize that some of the people that connect most with my poems are maybe kids similar to me who maybe grew up connected with their heritages in a way, but also distanced from them. So I think if anyone, maybe that's the audience that I'm maybe imagining might relate most. But honestly, anyone who wants to read, please do.
Yeah. I guess I really hope that one day my poems could be read by people who don't usually read English poems. I don't know if that's impossible. I'm thinking of the Hong Kong people that I write about, and yeah, but it's interesting because I do like letting strangers read my works. I don't really like having people who actually know me read my works. I don't know if that's a strange thing. But yeah, and also I do find it cathartic when strangers read your work, because a lot of the things that I write come from really painful places. And usually the people who are living through that pain don't really want to read that. They would rather just sleep or have take a break or whatever. So in a way, I don't know, like, am I reaching my ideal audience now? But I'm reaching some people that I never expected, and maybe that's a good thing too. Yeah.
We have had a few questions in the chat. Let's see how many we can get through before we need to wrap up in a few minutes' time. First one, where does your joy reside? Great question. All three of you tackle societal issues or in service of communities. How do you take care of your mind and heart? Oh, almost like a self-care kind of question.
I think it's good to keep in mind that always at the heart of a lot of these difficult stories that we tell, there is always this tenderness and survival. And that is where kind of my heart, I think, resides when I'm trying to write. I keep in mind, like, alongside difficulty, my family's like enduring tenderness and their determination to survive and, you know, give themselves a better life. So yeah, I think that's what helps me get through writing about difficult things.
I don't know, I've actually read quite a lot of poems that I think surround around self-care. So I remember there was this really famous poem that Cheng keeps sharing on his social media, Why Bother? He's like, at some point, write that poem, because at some point that poem is going to be the exact shape of someone's wounds. So that's not exactly a joyful thing, but I do think, like, for me, joy and pain are kind of together. So sometimes it's kind of pain could be so like thorough, like it wakes you up to a new thing, and that's joyful in themselves. But back to like real joy, I really enjoy hanging out with friends, spend my time together with friends, not talking about poems. And for some reason, poems will come forth from all those experiences that are poetic themselves. And also drink a lot of hot water. It's really good for health. Yeah. Yeah, and also like that really brings back to like what a community is like, to be honest. Like, yes, you get to choose to be in a community, but you should be able to take a break from that community once in a while. And that's super important. Yeah.
I think perhaps, you know, to answer the question about joy, um, I would say, you know, not all of my poems tackle societal issues or in service of communities. As I said, I'm a pretty selfish writer. I write about myself a lot. So I sort of write to sometimes process thoughts, and especially thoughts relating to mental health, thoughts relating to you know, my experiences or trauma I've had in the past. So I would say, you know, that's how I sort of take care of my mind and heart as well. Because for me, um, again, it's more of a practice and sort of maybe a process of just laying things out, figuring them out. Yeah.
Right. I think there's more questions appearing, though. I do wonder how many more we'll have time for. So I think I'll leap now to this one from Felix and Louise. One question: how much of a role do you think poetry plays in society, especially Southeast Asian societies where English language poetry is seen as something uncommon or a privileged activity?
I think it's interesting because to maybe answer that, you have to look back a bit. It's like a lot of like really famous literature. I know in like this society, but also in Vietnamese society, was originally written in verse, and that was how kind of you know, use and traditions and whatever were disseminated. I also think that there's this kind of thing that I know from my mum, that there's a lot of poems that she learned as a girl that she still really remembers. So I guess there's a role there that they are something that you do hold on to. Even like they're just a seminal thing that you might kind of learn when you're young. But also if we kind of broaden the definition of poetry and think about songs, so during the war, a lot of songs were banned in Vietnam. And to me, that feels like a recognition of the power of, you know, words and music together. So yeah, I think they have a role. But yeah, like you say, it can probably be limited, like it can be anywhere.
I suppose perhaps I can respond to that as well, because I feel like you know, writing in English in an Asian society, especially in I guess East Asian, Southeast Asian, even South Asian societies, it's more than bilingualism, is diglossia. I feel like, you know, there's obviously different, you know, status sort of attached to different languages, and you use them in different scenarios for different things. And for me, I'm really, you know, thinking of two works, or rather two writers. I'm thinking of Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, and also Mary Jean Chan's the sentiment she expresses in Flesh, how the tongue we write in is not really ours, and the whole idea of, you know, really because of, you know, societies, you know, places being colonized, and we end up, you know, being educated, made, you know, primarily in one tongue, and that ends up being the tongue perhaps we're more comfortable writing in, or thinking about certain topics in. And I really don't see, you know, sometimes I feel like there's perhaps a bit of a tension, you know. I have a Chinese face, I have a Chinese surname, I should probably write in Chinese, but I guess at the end of the day, perhaps it had to do with my education. And I mean, and also, you know, lots of colonial legacy that, you know, we don't really get to choose. So yeah, I guess that didn't really answer the question, I guess, but just my thoughts that it's not really merely choosing between the languages that you know or you're fluent in, you can speak in or write in. It's what language is kind of nearer to that area that you're either, you know, writing or speaking about.
I know I'm actually quite hopeful about English language poetry in Southeast Asia, because I do think a lot of us would like to write things that people around us don't understand. So English could be a thing that like a lot of people don't understand. So that's really liberating. And also I taught some students, they are of really lower English ability and intellectual ability. And for some reason, they find poetry everywhere. They find poetry in posters and stickers, in hip hop songs or whatever. So, and they are actually more in tune with English than we have thought. It's just that the English, the poetics in the English that they're in tune with might not be what's out there in the publisher's mind. But I'm actually quite hopeful about that. And I think maybe that's one of the last few places where we could just be ourselves and just play with languages. Yeah, because English, as important as it is, I don't think we really understand it beyond a functional level. Yeah, so still some places to hide from.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we should probably wrap up now and give you a break. You've worked incredibly hard, but it's been thrilling to listen to. An afternoon full of joy for all of us. Especially me. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving up your lunchtime, early afternoon to us today. And let's give our readers, Tim, Laura Jane, Natalie, all a big virtual round of applause.